Sawate ladies. So what we're going to cover today is chapter 34 of Wheelock, which is deponent verbs and the ablative with special deponents. The good news here is that you really don't have to learn very many new forms, really only one new form that you haven't had to learn before, and that's the passive imperative. But you do need to pay special attention to your new verbs that are going to be deponent verbs. Okay, so what do I mean by deponent verbs? Deponent verbs are a special class of verbs that, for the most part, only have passive forms, but they also only translate actively. Okay? They can be any conjugation, so there are first conjugation deponents, second conjugation deponents, third IOs, fourths, all of them. And you conjugate these deponent verbs as passives in whatever conjugation they are in. So, for example, hortor, hortare, which means to urge or to encourage, is going to conjugate as a first conjugation passive. Okay, it's going to follow the passive forms for the first conjugation. And then, so that's it. That's why you really don't need to learn very many new forms for this particular chapter. Now, because deponent verbs do not have active forms, they only have three principal parts, right? Because the third principal part of a regular verb is the first person singular perfect active indicative. But since a deponent verb isn't going to have an active form, there you go. We lose a principal part. The three principal parts that the deponent verbs do have are the first person singular present indicative, obviously looking like a passive, the present infinitive, which looks like a passive, and the third person singular perfect indicative, which looks like a passive. I have given you an example of a first conjugation deponent, hortor, hortare, hortatus sum. A second conjugation deponent, fateor, fatere, fasus sum, which means to confess. A third conjugation deponent, loquor, loqui, locutus sum, which means to talk. Patior, a third IO, third IO conjugation deponent, patior, pati, passus sum, which means to suffer, and then a fourth conjugation deponent, which is molior, moliri, molitus sum, which means to build. So there are no new forms to learn. Yay! Well, except for the one new form that you have to learn, which is the imperative. Boo! So how do you form a passive imperative? Well, you haven't learned how to form a passive imperative yet because they're really actually not that common. Really, the only time you're going to see the passive infinitive is actually when it's the present infinitive for a deponent. So that's why you're learning it now. The singular imperative looks like the non-existent present active infinitive. So if this deponent verb were to have a present active infinitive, it would look like hortare, right? But of course it doesn't exist. So hortare instead is going to be, I just pointed at the screen instead of using my arrow. Silly Miss F. Hortare is going to be the singular command, urge, okay? The plural deponent imperative is going to look like the second person plural present indicative. So hortomony is how you tell more than one person or command more than one person to urge, okay? The only thing you need to be careful about, so notice this highlighted, or I should say emboldened, italicized for the most part up here. The reason why I have done that is because the participles and the infinitives break the rules a little bit. They break the rules in intuitive ways that you can understand, but they still break the rules. The present and future participles have active forms and they translate actively. Okay, so despite the fact that deponents, for the most part, have only passive forms but translate actively, the present and future participles have active forms and translate actively. The gerundive has a passive form and translates passively. Again, despite the fact that deponent verbs, for the most part, have passive forms and active meanings, The gerundive has the passive form and the passive meaning. And remember, the gerundive is the future passive participle, okay? Also, the future infinitive has an active form and an active meaning. So those are the little caveats you need to look out for, okay? Now, what we are going to do next is we're going to look at each of the conjugations of the deponent verb. I have them all spelled out in the indicative, in the subjunctive, and then in the imperative, participle, and infinitive. I do want you to write all of these down. First of all, because they provide a nice review of passive forms, which we haven't had in a while. But secondly, because I want you to have this resource that you created that you can go back and consult. So you're going to have to push pause is what I'm telling you so that you can write all these forms down. All right, so we start with the first conjugation. I need to bring this down a little bit. Hopefully you can see that a little better now. First conjugation, hortor, hortare, hortata sum. I told you this means to urge. So hortor, I urge. So again, let me hit this hard. They look passive, but they translate actively for the most part. Okay, so our present indicative, hortor, hortaris, hortator, hortamor, hortamini, hortantor. Translating actively, I urge, you urge, she urges, we urge, y'all urge, they urge, okay? The imperfect indicative, hortabar, hortabaris, hortabator, hortabamor, hortabamini, hortabantor. And then the future, hortabor, hortabaris, hortabitor, hortabimor, hortabimini, hortabuntor. So the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect indicative are going to use the fourth principal part as you expect because they're going to look like regular passives, still translating actively. So hortatus, hortata, hortatum, sum, right? And again, you're going to have to change the ending on that fourth principal part on the perfect passive participle to match whatever the subject is. So hortatus sum, hortatus est, hortatus est, hortati sumus, hortati estis, hortati sunt. Pluperfect, hortatus aram, hortatus aras, hortatus arat, hortati aramus, hortati aratus, hortati arant. So I had urged versus the perfect I urged. And then our future perfect, hortatus aro, hortatus aris, hortatus arit, hortati aremus, hortati aritus, hortati arunt. Okay. I also give you guys the subjunctive forms. So horter, horteris, hortetur, hortamor, hortamini, hortentur. This is the only tense of the subjunctive that you're really going to have a translation for. So let me urge, let you urge, let him urge, let us urge, let y'all urge, let them urge. Okay. The imperfect subjunctive forms with the sort of non-existent present active infinitive plus the ending. So again, there's a little wiggle room on the forms as you can see, but these are still passive forms. Okay, so hortarer, hortareris, hortaretur, hortaremor, hortaremini, hortarenter. Okay. Perfect subjunctive and pluperfect subjunctive form exactly like you would expect it to, fourth principal part, or maybe more accurately, I should say perfect passive participle or perfect participle, plus sim si sit, simus sit assent, and assamus ais asset, assamus assatus assent, okay? Again, this is where we get to the imperative participles and infinitives, so important information for you guys. Hortare is how you urge one person. Hortamini, you urge more than one person. Notice that you have a form for each of the participle tenses that you expect, right? The present participle looks like it has the active forms, but it still translates actively. So hortans, hortantus means urging. The perfect, hortatus, hortata, hortatum is the follows the rules exactly because that is the passive forms, but it translates actively, having urged. The future, hortaturus, looks active and translates actively, about to urge. And the gerundive, hortandus, means to be urged. So passive form, passive translation. The infinitive, there are three tenses. There's the present infinitive, which is the second principal part, exactly what we expect, translating actively to urge. Hortatum, 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 essay. I always give you guys the accusative endings on the infinitive since infinitives are so often used in indirect statement. Means to have urged, and hortatorum, esse means to be about to urge. Okay. I now have these same charts for all the other conjugations. I'm not going to go through them as thoroughly as I just did. I want you to pause and to write these forms down, okay? So, fateor, fatere, fasus sum means to confess, so you can see the present indicative forming, as you now know, a deponent will form with the passive forms, but with the active translation. The imperfect, again, nothing surprising here. Future, okay. The perfect, again, exactly what you guys expect, okay. Same with the subjunctive, fatiaris, right? Remember the present subjunctive forming based on conjugation, we, fear, liar, right? First, second, third, IO, fourth. So we have the fear here, EA. Imperfect subjunctive, again, exactly what you now expect for a deponent, that sort of invented present active infinitive with the passive endings. Again, perfect subjunctive, pluperfect subjunctive, exactly what you expect it to be. And then the imperative participles infinitives now also the way you expect them to be. Fatere, confess. Fatemini, more than one person, confess. Okay, fateins, fatentes, so on and so forth. Third conjugation, loquor, loqui, locutus sum, means to talk. So again, there's nothing here that's of any surprise. I just want to remind you that the only difference between a second person singular present indicative and a second person singular future indicative is the macron. So it's a very important macron that you guys remember, okay? Again, perfect, pluperfect, future perfect indicative, exactly what you expect. The subjunctives, forming just as you expect, okay? Perfect and pluperfect subjunctive, same. Present imperative, participles and infinitives now exactly what you're expecting, okay? Third IO, again, exactly what you expect. These are the third IO passive forms for the present, imperfect, and future. Perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. You're going to have to stop. You pause the video to get all this down. You have the present subjunctive and the perfect subjunctive, perfect and pluperfect subjunctive, exactly what you expect. And now, of course, you see that the present imperative and the participles and infinitives are working exactly the way you expect them to. Same for the fourth, okay? All of this following the new rules for deponents. Okay, so we're going to have to skip along quite quickly. I would like for you guys to write down these sentences. We will go over them tomorrow in class and attempt to translate them, realizing that the deponent verbs are going to translate actively. Okay, so semi-deponent verbs. You have actually learned two semi-deponent verbs already, audio and gaudio. Audio means to dare. It's semi-deponent, just like gaudio, which means that its present system has an active and a passive, but its perfect system only has passive forms that translate actively. So for example, libere felicaturque vivere audio versus libere felicaturque vivere auso sum. I dare to live freely and happily versus I dared to live freely and happily. The last thing I need you to know about is the ablative with special deponents. Certain deponent verbs, the ones listed on this slide, take an ablative as in place of a direct object, more or less, okay? So you just have to know about that new ablative use. Dacti mentibus suis utentur non armis. So learned men use their own minds, not